And we are coming on the air with a story that has been building quietly for months and has now reached a breaking point. If you have followed this program, you know the numbers. You know that Cuba has been running on empty, blackouts stretching across whole provinces, gas stations with no gas, hospitals rationing power. In October of 2024, the island's national grid collapsed entirely, plunging all 11 million people into darkness at once. And it has teetered on the edge of that failure ever since. For much of the past year, one country kept the lights from going out completely. That country was Mexico. And this morning, that lifeline is being pulled tight because the United States has put a price on it, the threat of tariffs. Good morning. Let's get straight to it. For years, when Cuba came up in the headlines, the frame was familiar. The embargo, the old cars, the migration crisis, the long, grinding standoff between Havana and Washington. That was the story we thought we knew. But over the last 12 months, a different story took shape. One that had nothing to do with speeches and everything to do with tankers. Ship after ship, loaded with crude oil and fuel, left Mexican ports and crossed the Gulf toward the island. And almost no one outside the energy world was watching. Here are the facts, and every one of them is on the record. In 2025, Mexico's state oil company, Pemex, supplied Cuba with roughly 15,000 barrels of crude oil per day, plus around 2,200 barrels a day of refined products, jet fuel, diesel, gasoline. Add it up, and you're looking at somewhere near $500 million in oil and fuel sent to a single island over a single year. Most of it moved through the port of Coatzacoalcos in Veracruz, with additional shipments out of Tampico. This was not charity whispered about in back rooms. This was a sustained, industrial-scale supply operation. And here is why it mattered so much. Cuba's power stations are aging, Soviet-era thermoelectric plants that burn crude to generate electricity, and without a steady flow of imported fuel, they simply cannot run. By 2025, those Mexican shipments covered close to 17% of all the fuel Cuba consumed. Look only at the oil Cuba imported from abroad, and Mexico's share climbs to around 44%. Nearly half of the island's foreign oil coming from one neighbor. To understand how Mexico ended up in that position, you have to go back a step because it wasn't the plan. It happened by default. For decades, Cuba's supplier of first resort was not Mexico. It was Venezuela. Caracas and Havana had an alliance built on oil, cheap crude flowing north in exchange for Cuban doctors, security advisors, political loyalty. But Venezuela's own oil industry has been crumbling for years, and then, in December, the pressure tightened. The United States moved against Venezuelan tankers bound for Cuba, choking off that route. And when the Venezuelan supply faltered, Cuba turned to the one government in the region willing to step in: Mexico. The shipments began under President Andrés Manuel López Obrador, who framed them as an act of solidarity with a struggling neighbor, and they carried on after Claudia Sheinbaum took office. That is how a neighbor became a lifeline, not through some grand ideological pact, but because someone had to fill the gap, and Mexico did. Now, everything that seemed settled has been thrown into question, and the reason is a single document signed in Washington. On January 29th, 2026, President Donald Trump signed Executive Order 14380, titled Addressing Threats to the United States by the Government of Cuba. With that signature, the administration declared a national emergency with respect to Cuba and did something that reached far beyond the island itself. It authorized the United States to impose tariffs on imports from any country that directly or indirectly supplies oil to the Cuban government. Read that again: indirectly. That word is deliberate. It is a warning shot aimed not at Havana, but at Havana suppliers. And there is one supplier that towers above the rest. One country for which American tariffs would not be a nuisance, but a catastrophe: Mexico. If you're following this story, take a moment to subscribe to the channel so you don't miss where it goes next, because this is moving fast and the next chapter is already being written. Here is the bind Mexico now finds itself in, and it is a genuinely brutal one. On one side sits Cuba, a neighbor in the middle of a humanitarian emergency, dependent on Mexican fuel to keep hospitals and water pumps running. On the other side sits the United States, Mexico's largest trading partner by an enormous margin, the destination for the overwhelming majority of Mexican exports. cars, electronics, produce, steel. The entire Mexican economy is wired into the American market. So the threat of tariffs is not abstract. It is a threat to the thing that keeps millions of Mexicans employed. Keep sending oil to Cuba and risk the levies. Stop sending oil and let a neighbor go dark. That is the choice laid on President Claudia Sheinbaum's desk. And her response has told us a great deal. Sheinbaum warned publicly that the tariff threat could trigger, in her words, a far-reaching humanitarian crisis in Cuba, one that could hit the island hospitals, its food supply, its basic services. She did not frame this as a trade dispute. She framed it as a matter of human survival. At the same time, she announced that Mexico would send humanitarian aid, food support, to Cuba, and she made clear she intended to keep negotiating directly with Washington to ease the pressure. Publicly, Pemex signaled it would continue exports. But then came the reports that Mexico had, in fact, halted its oil shipments to the island. And when asked about those reports directly, Sheinbaum did not deny them. That silence may be the most revealing detail of all. Think about what that tells you. A government that spent a year keeping Cuba supplied, that publicly defended those shipments as a matter of principle. And yet, when the tariff threat landed, the tankers appear to have stopped. Not with a decree, not with a speech, just quietly, ship by ship, the flow slowing. That is the weight of American economic leverage in this hemisphere, applied without a single shot fired. So who wins here and who pays? Start with who pays, because that part is not in doubt. Cuba, an island already living through rolling blackouts, already rationing electricity, already watching its people leave in record numbers, now losing the supplier that filled nearly half its imported oil. Every barrel that doesn't arrive is fewer hours of power, less fuel for the ambulances, more strain on a system that was already near collapse. The Mexican government itself has warned that the consequences fall hardest on ordinary Cubans, not on the officials the sanctions are meant to target. As for Washington's calculation, it is coldly logical. The goal is to isolate the Cuban government by cutting off the last dependable channels of energy, first Venezuela, now Mexico, and to do it not by attacking Cuba directly, but by making it too expensive for anyone else to help. The tariff threat turns every potential supplier into a reluctant enforcer of American policy. You don't have to sanction Cuba if you can simply make the whole world afraid to sell to it. And Mexico? Mexico is caught precisely in the middle, trying to be two things at once, a loyal trading partner and a good neighbor, and discovering that in this standoff, it may not be allowed to be both. Sheinbaum is betting on negotiation, on the idea that she can carve out some humanitarian exception, some room to send food and medicine even as the oil stops. Whether Washington grants that room is the open question hanging over all of this. Now, a word of precision because it matters. As of this broadcast, these tariffs are a threat and an authorization. Not, in the sweeping sense, a wall of levies already imposed on Mexican goods over this specific issue. The executive order opens the door. It creates the framework. It puts the power to punish in the administration's hands and dares any supplier to test it. That is a different thing from tariffs already collected at the border, and anyone telling you otherwise is getting ahead of the facts. What is real is the leverage, and the fact that the leverage already appears to be working, with those Mexican shipments reportedly drying up. So where does this leave us? An island on the edge, watching its lifeline thin out. A Mexican president threading a needle between her economy and her conscience, sending food while the oil goes quiet. And a policy in Washington that has learned it can reshape the map of an entire hemisphere's energy supply with a signature and the promise of a tariff. The tankers that crossed the Gulf all year are the story now. Not because of what they carried, but because of what happens when they stop. And on that question, the one that decides whether the lights stay on for 11 million people, no one in Havana, Mexico City, or Washington can yet tell you how